Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. We all play roles in life, like actors on a stage. But what happens when the script no longer suits us? When the mundane becomes a dark screen, hiding our desires? I thought I knew my role: wife, support, friend. But what if behind all these facades lies something more? Something that makes my heart beat faster and my thoughts wander into forbidden territory? This is a story about one wrong decision that can destroy everything that once seemed important, yet at the same time, offer a taste of the very freedom I was afraid to even think about. One night at dinner, everything changed. It was an ordinary evening. John and I were sitting at the table, and everything seemed in its place: food, plates, wine in my glass. It appeared to be a cozy family dinner. But the coziness was like smoke, spreading into the corners of the room, elusive and false. We sat across from each other like strangers on a crowded train, forced to share space but nothing more. I looked at John, at his tired face, at his eyes staring somewhere through me, as if his real life was behind my silhouette, one I couldn't see. Just a year ago, he would laugh, joke, talk about his plans. But now his words were dry, like parchment. Work had consumed him completely, leaving me with mere scraps, the shadow of the man I had once loved. The silence was only broken by the clinking of cutlery. The words I wanted to say stuck in my throat like a lump. I couldn't find the right ones, didn't know how to rekindle the fire that once warmed us. At that moment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Scott, my boss. "Jessica, come to the private corporate party on Friday. It'll be fun. Hope you can make it." I felt my heart beat a little faster in my chest. Scott had always been polite, attentive to me, noticing me not just as an employee, but as a woman. It was as if he knew exactly what I was missing. I read the message and glanced at John. He hadn't noticed a thing. He just pushed his plate away and reached for his phone, returning to his work. Why not? I thought, replying to Scott's message with a simple, "I'll be there." I didn't think about the consequences, didn't ponder what John would say if he found out. All I wanted at that moment was to feel alive, to feel needed by someone, to know that someone could see me. When the evening ended, John and I went to separate rooms. He to finish his work, me to dive into books that no longer brought joy. It felt like I was reading not words, but a collection of letters devoid of meaning. My mind was spinning with thoughts. What happened to us? How did we end up in this void? There was no answer, and that made it hurt even more. The next day, I thought about the party for a long time. Should I go? Scott. He was the kind of person who could create an atmosphere of celebration, lightness, and freedom around him. His invitation felt like a breath of fresh air to me. What if I allowed myself that breath? Even if it was naive, even if it was foolish, I wanted so badly to forget about the silent evenings and the looks that meant nothing. On Friday, when John came home, I was already ready. The dress fit perfectly, my hair was styled, my lips slightly touched with lipstick. I told him I was going to meet colleagues. He looked up, a little surprised by my appearance, but didn't ask any questions. He just nodded, returning to his phone. As I stepped outside, a strange feeling washed over me, a mixture of fear and excitement. This was the moment I was crossing a line, leaving behind the familiar world where the rules were clear, where I was the faithful wife. I felt like this night would change something inside me. Maybe not immediately, but certainly forever. At the office party, I saw Scott right away. His smile was wide and open, as if he was genuinely happy to see me. He approached me with a glass of champagne, and we exchanged small talk, laughed at something, while inside me, something began to melt. The ice around my heart started to crack under the warmth of his words. Scott looked at me the way John hadn't looked at me in a long time. His gaze was alive, curious. He saw something in me beyond just an employee. In his presence, I felt important, needed. And when he suggested we go up to the office rooftop to look at the city lights, I didn't hesitate. Why not? After all, I deserved this moment, a moment when I could forget about everything that had been holding me back. When we reached the rooftop, the wind cooled my face, and the city lay before us like an open palm. Scott came closer and draped his jacket over my shoulders. It was a simple gesture, but there was a care in it that I hadn't felt in a long time. We talked about work, about life, about small things that suddenly seemed important. I looked at his face, at the faint smile, at the sparks in his eyes, and I realized I was afraid of this moment, afraid that it would end. We stood next to each other, and I didn't know what would happen next. Inside, there was fear, but also a strange, frightening attraction. I didn't know where this would lead, but I knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. Scott suggested something unusual, a picnic on the office rooftop. The moment I arrived there, I felt something shift inside me. The office building, usually associated with endless hours of work, suddenly appeared in a new light. The night city stretched out beneath us, hundreds of lights twinkling, as if inviting us to become part of this magical landscape. A blanket was spread on the rooftop, with small lanterns scattered around, creating a cozy and warm atmosphere. Scott was waiting for me near the edge, gazing at the city lights. When he turned and smiled at me, I felt a warmth spread inside. It was the attention I had been craving, something that made me feel alive and desired. We sat on the blanket, and I noticed how easily and naturally Scott spoke, asking about my life, genuinely interested in my opinions. His attention was so sincere that I couldn't help but smile. He talked about work, colleagues, and how important it is to sometimes forget about everything and simply enjoy the moment. I didn't even notice when our conversation shifted to more personal topics. You know, Jessica, there's something I've wanted to tell you for a while, he began, looking at me with a depth in his eyes that I hadn't seen in so long. You're not just an amazing professional, you're also an incredible woman. You always find time for everyone, always try to help. You're strong, and I really admire you. Those words touched something deep inside me. It had been so long since I'd heard anything like that, since I'd felt appreciated not only as a family member or an employee, but as a woman. I looked at him, and it felt as if the world around me started to change. The city lights softened, the wind felt warmer. Everything that had surrounded me suddenly seemed insignificant, as if my entire life until this moment had lost its colors, and now they were coming back. We sat close together, and I noticed his hand subtly moving closer to mine. I felt his warmth, and knew that the line we were about to cross could change everything. There was something genuine in his words, something that felt real, unlike the cold indifference that ruled my home. He wasn't rushing. He didn't make any sudden moves. His slow, gentle touches felt natural, not forbidden. We talked about our dreams, about the things each of us had missed in life. As I listened to Scott, it felt like I was looking in a mirror. He too was lonely, despite all his charm and the success he projected. Perhaps it was this shared understanding that connected us, the realization that deep down, we both longed for something more than the everyday routine. Do you think things can really change? I asked suddenly, looking at the distant city lights. Scott smiled, and there was a confidence in his smile that gave me hope. I believe there's always a choice in life. We decide what our next step will be. He looked at me, and I could feel the tension between us growing. It was like a magnetic force that couldn't be ignored. I didn't know what would happen next, but at that moment, I realized one thing. I wanted to live. I wanted to feel, to be desired, to be part of something bigger than just a normal life. And though it was just an evening on the rooftop, with lanterns and a blanket, for me, it became the first step towards feeling like myself again. The evening ended, but something inside me had changed. Scott walked me to my car, and we said goodbye without crossing that fragile boundary. But I knew that our next meeting would be different. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the verge of something important, something that wouldn't let me sink back into the gray, faceless routine. I got into the car and drove away, but the thoughts of that evening on the rooftop, of Scott's words, wouldn't leave me. It was just a picnic, but it gave me hope that my life could be different, and I knew that now everything would change. A few days later, Scott invited me to a private art exhibition in the city center. It was a rare opportunity, an event only for the chosen few, and honestly, I was flattered. The evening promised to be special, and this anticipation lifted my mood, which had stayed with me since our rooftop meeting. I wore my favorite dress, simple yet elegant, and tried not to think about what John would say. As usual, he didn't ask anything. The exhibition hall was small and cozy, with dim lighting that highlighted the beauty of the paintings. Soft shadows played on the walls, creating an almost magical atmosphere. We wandered along the canvases, examining the images, discussing every brushstroke, every color, as if trying to decipher what the artist wanted to tell us. I could feel the tension between us growing, the kind that could no longer be ignored. Scott offered me a glass of wine, and I accepted. The wine was sharp, its taste lingering on my tongue, causing a slight dizziness. We stopped at one of the paintings. It depicted the sea, vast and stormy, and for some reason, I wanted to lose myself in that image, dissolve into it, forget all my doubts and anxieties. "Do you see how it churns?" Scott asked, looking at the painting, but I sensed that his words were directed at me. "Yes," I replied quietly, without taking my eyes off the canvas. "It's like a reflection of what's inside." Scott looked at me, and in his gaze, I saw understanding. He stepped closer, and his hand gently touched mine. At that moment, I felt that I couldn't resist. His touch was light, barely noticeable, but it felt so real that I couldn't pull my hand away. My head spun slightly from the wine, from his proximity, from everything happening around me. "Jessica," he whispered, leaning toward me, and I could hear his breath mixing with mine. "I've wanted to do this for a long time." He took my hand, and we stepped out onto the balcony. The night city sprawled beneath us, and the breeze cooled my flushed cheeks. The moment I turned toward him, he slowly moved closer and gently touched my lips. That kiss was like a spark, a moment of weakness that seemed to divide my life into before and after. Everything inside me trembled, and I knew that this moment would change everything. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to forget everything about John, our home, my responsibilities. Scott kissed me gently, as if afraid to shatter this fragile moment. When we pulled away, I couldn't find the words. Everything that was happening felt so unreal, as if it were a dream I didn't want to wake from. Scott looked at me, his eyes glowing with a feeling I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, and I nodded, unable to speak. Inside me, contradictions raged. I knew this was wrong, knew that I would go home and feel guilty. But at that moment, on the balcony, with a view of the city, with Scott beside me, I felt alive. And that vivid, real emotion overshadowed everything else. I realized that this evening was the start of something that could destroy my familiar world, but I couldn't stop. For too long, I had been living in a gray void, and now, when vibrant colors began to fill my life again, I didn't want to let them go. We returned to the hall, and I felt like the world around me had changed. The paintings seemed brighter, the shadows deeper, and I myself, different. Scott smiled at me, and I knew this moment would stay with me forever. It was just a kiss, but it changed everything. Now, I stood on the edge of something new, something unknown, and I could feel the whirlwind of events pulling me in, one I had chosen to dive into. Rollerblading with Scott was one of those ideas that seemed harmless, even fun, at first. I hadn't skated since high school, and honestly, I was a bit excited. We met at a park with plenty of space for skating, where the trees created a cozy, shaded corner on a warm summer day. Scott was already waiting by the entrance, smiling and waving at me. His positive energy was contagious, and I felt my worries slowly melt away. I put on the skates, and for the first few minutes, I felt unsteady. Scott gently took my hand, helping me find my balance. I smiled at him, and we started moving, first slowly, then picking up a bit of speed. The sense of freedom, the wind in my hair, Scott's laughter, felt so simple yet so real. We skated side by side, holding hands, talking about work, life, and sharing what had been building up inside for a long time. You know, I've always wanted to live closer to nature, Scott said, looking at a tree under whose shade we paused for a moment. Maybe even buy a cabin in the mountains, away from all the hustle. Sometimes it feels like the city is taking something important from us. I get that, I replied, trying to keep my balance. Sometimes you just want to escape, leave everything behind and start over. Scott glanced at me with a warmth I could feel even in his silence. We skated, chatted about random things, laughed whenever one of us wobbled. The atmosphere was relaxed and carefree. At some point, I felt so light and free that I even forgot about the doubts that had been clouding my mind. It was like a return to childhood, carefree and joyful. But just when I felt confident on the skates, something unexpected happened. Maybe I overestimated my ability, or maybe I just lost focus. But in one moment, I felt myself losing balance. The world spun around me, and the next thing I knew, I had fallen on my knee. Pain shot through me, forcing a sharp breath out in surprise. Scott was immediately by my side, helping me up. Are you okay? His voice was full of concern, and in his eyes, I saw genuine worry. I... I'm not sure. I tried to stand, but the pain in my leg was too much. I think I hurt myself pretty badly. Scott didn't hesitate for a second. He gently helped me over to the nearest bench and carefully examined my knee. The injury wasn't too serious, but it was painful enough that I couldn't stand properly. Let me take you to my place. I'll clean this up, he offered, his voice so calm and confident that I immediately agreed. It seemed easier than trying to get home on my own in this condition. Scott helped me to his car, and we drove to his apartment. While we were driving, I tried to distract myself from the pain by talking. Scott shared some funny stories from work, and his attempts to cheer me up actually worked. When we finally arrived at his place, he helped me out of the car and, with his arm around my shoulders, guided me into his apartment. Scott's apartment was cozy, bright, filled with plants and books. It reflected his character, calm, thoughtful, a lover of nature. He carefully sat me on the couch and told me not to move while he got the first aid kit. When he returned, he had bandages, antiseptic, and everything else he needed. You're going to have to take off your pants, he said with a playful smile, trying to lighten the mood. I blushed but smiled back, feeling the awkwardness between us fade. Scott gently helped me remove my pants, exposing the injury. His hands were steady and his touch was careful. He cleaned the wound with antiseptic, and I winced in pain, but his soothing voice immediately calmed me. It's going to be okay, just hang in there a little longer, he said, dressing the wound and applying the bandage. His care touched me deeply. At that moment, I felt that there was something more between us than just attraction. It was genuine care, the kind of attention I had been missing for so long. Scott wasn't just doing what he had to. He truly cared about me, and it was evident in every movement, every word. When he finished, I quietly thanked him. He sat down beside me, his gaze soft and full of warmth. You know, it really matters to me that you're okay, he said, and there wasn't a hint of pretense in his voice. I would never have let you fall if I could have prevented it. Those words pierced straight to my heart. In that moment, I realized Scott wasn't just someone I was physically attracted to. He was someone who cared about me, someone who was ready to support me, who saw me for who I was and appreciated that. I felt my emotional attachment to him grow even stronger, and that feeling unsettled me. We sat for a while longer, chatting about random things, but I could feel the attachment inside me deepening. The pain in my leg gradually subsided, but something else, deeper and more inexplicable, began to stir inside. It was a feeling I couldn't ignore. I looked at Scott and realized that this man had become more than just a colleague or a boss. He was my refuge, my source of light, at a time when everything around me seemed so gray and lifeless. When the evening finally came to an end, Scott offered to drive me home, and I agreed. In the car, we rode in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, full of understanding and warmth. I knew that things between us would never be the same. This day, the care he had shown me had changed everything. I felt like I was becoming part of something new, something important, and the thought both scared and inspired me. When I got home, John was already asleep. I quietly walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his sleeping figure. Thoughts of the day, of Scott, of what was happening between us swirled in my mind. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. Too much was pulling me toward him. His care, his attention, his ability to make me feel alive. That day, that rollerblading, his care for me, it all became a revelation. I realized I couldn't live the way I had been anymore. I wanted to feel, to be needed, to be with someone who saw the real me. And although I didn't know where it would lead, I was ready to take a step forward, to leave behind my fears and doubts, and give myself a chance at happiness, no matter how risky it was. Scott suggested spending the weekend at a private house by the ocean. The idea seemed crazy to me, and, at the same time, incredibly alluring. The ocean, freedom, the chance to escape reality, even for just a couple of days, to get away from everything that weighs so heavily on my shoulders. I told John that I was going to visit a friend. He didn't even look at me when I said it, just nodded without asking questions. Maybe he didn't even hear me. That didn't surprise me anymore. Scott and I set off for the ocean on Friday evening. The drive was long, but this journey felt special, as if I had finally decided to do something important. Music played in the car, old rock songs that I loved, but that John never listened to. Scott was beside me, his hand resting on the steering wheel, and the other occasionally touched mine, as if to make sure I was there, that I was with him. I closed my eyes and imagined us arriving at the shore, feeling the salty wind on my skin, forgetting about everything in the world. When we arrived, the house was even better than I had imagined, small but cozy, with windows that opened directly onto the ocean. We stepped inside, and I felt a wave of calm envelop me. I kicked off my shoes, walked to the window, and saw the waves crashing against the shore. That sound, powerful and mesmerizing, made me forget all my problems. Scott came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my shoulders, and I felt his warmth seep into me, his closeness soothing all my worries. Those 2 days were something extraordinary. We walked along the shore, ran barefoot on the sand, and laughed as the water rose and washed over our feet. I felt how every moment with Scott became more special, how every second with him made me feel alive. We cooked together, simple meals, but they seemed tastier than any restaurant food because we made them with smiles and laughter. We sat on the veranda, watching the sunset, saying nothing, but the silence was full. It was filled with the words we were afraid to speak aloud. On the evening of the second day, Scott lit a bonfire on the beach. The flames slowly rose, casting shadows on his face, and I watched him, trying to memorize every moment. He was so real, so genuine, that it scared me to think that this could all end. We sat close together, wrapped in a blanket, and I felt time slow down. The ocean roared, stars began to appear in the sky, and the moment felt perfect. "Jessica," Scott said quietly, looking into the fire, "I want you to know. I'm willing to do anything for you." I turned my head and looked at him. There was no doubt in his eyes, only confidence and warmth that I hadn't seen in anyone's eyes looking at me for a long time. His words made my heart clench. Willing to do anything for me? What does that mean? Can I really leave everything behind and start a new life with him? The thought was so tempting, yet so terrifying. Do you really mean that? I whispered, trying not to let him see how much his words had affected me. He looked at me, and in his gaze, I saw what I hadn't seen in a long time: confidence that I mattered, that I was more than just a wife, more than just someone's other half. He nodded, and his hand covered mine. I don't know what the future holds, he said, but I know one thing. I don't want to lose you. With you, I feel real. And if we have a chance, even a small one, I'm willing to risk everything. Those words pierced the deepest part of my soul. In that moment, I felt my heart tremble, as if all the walls I had built around myself were starting to crumble. I knew this was wrong. I knew that John was waiting for me at home, that my duties, my marriage, none of that could simply be thrown away like an old, useless thing. But with Scott, I felt alive, real, in a way I hadn't been in a long time. We sat by the fire, and his arm slid around my shoulders, pulling me closer. I felt his warmth, heard the steady and calm beating of his heart, and realized that right now, in this moment, I was truly happy. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know how long this illusion of freedom would last, but I was ready to give myself over to it completely, even if only for a while. As night fell on the shore, we stayed by the fire, gazing at the flames and the stars, and it felt as if the whole world had shrunk to this small corner by the ocean, where there was only us. I knew that I would have to go back, that reality would remind me of itself. But this moment, this night, was mine, and no one could take it away from me. I realized that I was now standing at a crossroads. Could I really leave everything behind and go away with Scott? Start a new life, free from all the obligations, from everything that had tied me down before? These questions tormented me, and at the same time, I understood that the answer couldn't be found in just one night. But I knew one thing: this weekend by the ocean had changed something inside me. It made me realize that I wanted more. I wanted freedom. I wanted to feel needed. I wanted to be with someone who was willing to do anything for me. When I closed my eyes, listening to the waves crashing against the shore, I allowed myself to dream. To dream of a new life, of a new me, one who would no longer be afraid, who would be able to move forward without looking back. And even though this dream was just an illusion, I was ready to let myself believe in it, if only for one night. After the weekend at the ocean, something changed. Coming back home was harder than I expected. The house, where I used to feel safe, now seemed cold and empty. John noticed it right away. He looked at me with curiosity, and I could see him trying to figure out what was going on. At first, his questions were innocent, about how I spent the weekend, about the friend I supposedly stayed with. But soon his suspicions began to grow. The phone, which used to ring almost constantly, was now silent. I didn't want to pick up when Scott called, preferring to respond to his messages when John wasn't looking. I started paying less attention to the house. Dinners that I used to prepare for the two of us now seemed pointless. I couldn't make myself pretend that everything was normal, even though I knew I had to. John began asking questions, and I could see the worry building in his eyes. "Jessica, you've become different," he said one evening as we sat at the table. His voice was soft, but there was a hint of concern in it. "You've distanced yourself. Is something wrong?" I looked up and saw genuine concern in his eyes. This was the John I knew years ago: attentive, caring, someone who always wanted to be there, to support me. But now his words felt distant. I knew I should answer, should explain, but what could I say? That I had met someone else, that I was feeling things I hadn't felt with him in a long time? "No, everything's fine. Just a lot of work," I lied, trying to smile. But my smile felt forced, and I could see that he didn't believe me. "Maybe you need a break? We could go somewhere together, spend some time." Just the two of us, he suggested, his voice filled with hope. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. But inside, guilt and fear were growing. I understood that John was trying to bring us back, to bring me back, but I knew it was already impossible. My heart was far away with Scott, and I couldn't change that. I tried. I really tried to feel something that connected me to John, but everything felt so empty, so distant. With each passing day, John became more suspicious. He started noticing how I would take my phone into another room whenever messages came in. His looks grew more intense, and I could feel the tension between us growing. He stopped asking directly, but I could see that he knew. He knew something was wrong, that I was hiding something important from him. One evening, he approached me as I stood by the window, staring out at the street. His hand touched my shoulder, and I flinched in surprise. I turned, and he was looking at me with pain in his eyes. Jessica, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Please, tell me what's going on. I feel like I'm losing you. Those words hit something deep inside me. I couldn't look him in the eye, couldn't bear that gaze full of pain and confusion. Inside, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I knew that if I didn't make a choice now, I would lose everything. But what was I supposed to choose? Stay with John and try to salvage what we had, or follow my feelings for Scott, which made me feel alive? I didn't answer. I just walked away silently into another room, leaving him standing by the window. That night, I couldn't sleep. Thoughts of John, of his words, of how he was trying to fight for us, wouldn't leave me alone. But every time I closed my eyes, Scott's image appeared before me. His smile, his voice, his confidence that we could be happy together. I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. I was at a crossroads, and I had to make a choice. But no matter what I chose, someone was going to get hurt. Either John, who still loved me, even though our relationship had long since become empty, or Scott, who had given me hope for a new life, a new version of myself. In the morning, I got up earlier than usual and went to the kitchen. John was already there, making coffee, his face tired, showing the signs of a sleepless night. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw hope. Hope that maybe I had changed my mind, that maybe we could fix everything, but I knew that wasn't the case. I walked up to him and quietly said, "We need to talk, John." His expression shifted slightly, and he nodded, setting the cup down on the table. I knew this conversation would be the hardest one of my life, but I also knew that I couldn't keep hiding anymore. I had to make a decision, take a step forward, no matter how difficult it was. "John," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm so sorry, but I don't feel anything for you anymore. I tried, I really did, to find what we once had, but it's gone. I've met someone else." I saw how his face changed, how he froze at first, as if not understanding what I had said, and then how pain appeared in his eyes, cutting through me like a knife. He remained silent, his eyes filled with tears, and in that moment, I felt our world, the world we had built together for so many years, begin to collapse. "What are you saying?" His voice was hoarse, full of disbelief. "You must be joking. This is some kind of nightmare, right?" I shook my head, feeling guilt tightening inside me. I wanted this to be a dream, so I could wake up and see that everything was okay. But I knew this was real. "Who is he?" John asked, his voice trembling. "Why? Why did this happen, Jessica?" I couldn't answer him. To say that I had found what I had been missing, that with Scott I felt alive, would have been too cruel. I just looked at him, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I love him, John," I said, and those words sounded like a sentence. "I can't live like this anymore. I don't want to lie to you or to myself." He jumped up, his face flushed with anger and pain. "How could you? We've been together for so many years. I've done everything for you, for us." His voice shook, and I could feel his fury filling the room. I couldn't say anything. I knew he was right, that I had betrayed him, but I also knew I couldn't go back. I had made my choice, no matter how painful it was. John, I'm so sorry, I whispered. I know this is terrible, but I can't live a lie anymore. I want to be with Scott. He turned away, his shoulders trembling, and I could see him struggling to process what he had just heard. I knew I had destroyed his world, and the thought haunted me. But I also knew it was the only way forward. I had to be honest, even if it meant causing him pain. John didn't respond. He just stood there, turned away from me, and in his silence, I felt all the pain I had caused. I knew that there was no going back now. I had made my choice, and all that was left was to move forward, leaving behind the past that had once been my life. I stepped closer, but John raised his hand, signaling for me to stop. I saw the look in his eyes, a mixture of anger and despair. He took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions, but the words still came out. Why? What did I do wrong? We could have tried to fix it. I would have done anything. It's not you, John. Please understand, it's not your fault, I said softly. I've changed. We've both changed. What we had is gone, and I can't bring it back, no matter how much I wish I could. I've tried, but my feelings now belong to someone else. He lowered his head, and I could see him fighting with himself, trying to hold back his tears. We stood there in the kitchen, a place that had once been the heart of our home, but now it had become the stage for the breakdown of everything we had built together. Are you sure this is what you want? He whispered, finally raising his head. His voice was filled with such pain that it made my heart ache. Yes, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though inside everything was screaming. I need to move forward, and I want to be honest with you. I don't want to live a lie anymore. John was silent for a long time, then nodded, as if accepting his defeat. He stepped back, letting me know that he wouldn't fight anymore. I knew that this moment would mark the beginning of a new life for both of us, a life where we would be apart. And no matter how much it hurt, I understood that this was the only right path. I left the kitchen, leaving him alone, knowing that this day would change everything. I had made my choice, and now all that was left was to move forward, leaving behind everything that had been. And maybe, someday, John would find his own happiness, just as I was trying to find mine. I moved in with Scott a few weeks after that conversation with John. It was a decision I made consciously, despite all the pain and doubts. The move wasn't easy for me. The things I packed felt like pieces of my past life that I was leaving behind. But I knew that to start a new chapter, I had to let go of everything that was holding me back. Scott welcomed me with a smile, his eyes glowing with the warmth I had been missing for so long. His apartment, though familiar to me, now felt like a new beginning. I brought only a few boxes, just the essentials, leaving behind most of the things that tied me to the past. We unpacked my things together, and I saw how much Scott was trying to make everything comfortable for me. He helped me find a place for every little item, listening to my stories about each trinket that held significance to me, and it was so human, so genuine. Our life together started simply, without grand words or promises. We got up early, made breakfast together, and took morning walks along the shore. I felt like life was starting to take on a new hue. For the first time in a long while, I could be myself. No pretending, no playing a role. Scott knew the real me, and that gave me a sense of freedom. We talked about everything, the past, the future, our dreams and fears. He listened to me like no one else had before, and I realized that I had finally found someone I could be open with. There were moments when I felt guilty about John. At night, lying next to Scott, I would think about the day I left, and it felt like I had let down a person who loved me. But Scott understood my feelings. He didn't rush me, didn't demand that I forget the past. He was just there, supporting me when I needed it, and giving me the space to deal with my emotions. A few weeks after moving in, We decided to go back to the ocean. It felt like a symbol of our new life, the place where everything began. We rented the same house, but this time I felt completely different. The ocean greeted us with warm waves, the sun shone brighter, and the air was filled with freshness. We spent 2 days walking along the shore, cooking over a fire, and sitting by the water under the stars. This time, I wasn't thinking about what would happen next. I was simply enjoying the moment, knowing that I had finally found what I had been searching for: peace, harmony, and love. On the second evening, as we sat by the fire, Scott took my hand and quietly said, "I want you to know that I'm grateful to you for choosing me, for giving us a chance. I know how hard this was for you, and I will never take it for granted." I looked at him, and in his eyes, I saw the sincerity I had been searching for so long. I smiled, feeling tears well up in my eyes. These were tears of relief, happiness, and love. I leaned in and kissed him, and at that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. I felt alive, free, and loved. Our life wasn't perfect. We had our struggles, our problems, but now I knew I could face them because I had someone beside me who believed in us. We were building our new life, step by step, leaving behind everything that had caused us pain. And maybe we had many more challenges ahead, but I knew one thing. With Scott, I was ready for it. I understood that the past would always be a part of me, but now it didn't define my life. I had started a new chapter, and this chapter was filled with love, light, and hope. Scott was by my side, and I knew we had everything we needed to be happy. We had chosen each other, and that was the most important choice of my life. If I could go back, I would do many things differently. I know that my actions caused pain to people who didn't deserve it. I destroyed something that had once been important, and I lost a lot. My decision to leave John and be with Scott marked the beginning of a new life for me, but that life was built on the ruins of the past. I'm not proud of what I did, and I don't want anyone to repeat my mistakes. Infidelity might seem like a way out of a difficult situation, an attempt to find yourself, but in reality, it brings pain and destruction. My decision was my own, and I cannot change the past. All I can do now is learn to live with what happened and try to build something better out of what remains. I'm telling my story not to justify myself, but to warn others. If you feel your marriage or relationship is falling apart, try to talk. Try to find a solution together before you do something that cannot be undone. Because no matter how hard you try, the past will stay with you, and you can never go back. But despite everything that happened, I've also realized that life is about moving forward. And sometimes, even through pain and mistakes, we find what truly matters. I found love, I found myself, and now, when I look ahead, I hope that I can become better and avoid repeating my past mistakes. This is my story, and I accept it with all its flaws and consequences.